Well, that's a great start. Hello, everyone. This is another episode of Enter the Matrix, and today we'll be talking with Brian and Jokull, who just came off a swinging victory at Birmingham Team Event. You might have already heard a little bit about their endeavor and how the whole tournament went from the Fireside Podcast, where Vic and David already spoke about it. But I'm planning on touching the topic in a slightly different way. So, how you guys are doing, Brian?
Doing great, man. Feeling good. I think this was, as far as I'm aware, the first time Team England's lost an event on their home soil ever. So that feels pretty good.
Yourself, Yakul?
Oh yeah, we got him this time, and I'm been on very happy this following week after the tournament. It's been a nice experience, great weekend, absolutely.
So you just said that you got them finally. You guys, I know, Brian, you attended last ITT with like basically Ignite Boys, but back then it was Dice Down. You, Yakul, I don't remember you attending those team events before. Am I correct?
Absolutely, I didn't attend. No, we've been talking about it with the Iceland boys, but it's been logistically difficult getting everyone up to speed, and then having 2/3 of the WTC team seems useful, but not as useful as it could be. And but yeah, I've faced the Team England guys a lot in single events, so it's very nice to get the full win here.
Makes perfect sense. And let's go straight into the meat of the topic. David mentioned, Yakul, that you were basically like brains behind the operation. And what I'm wondering at this point is, could you describe like your approach to dealing with pairings or like the whole team composition? I know you had some talks who should play what, but I'm asking more in the sense that you both worked, for example, with Mitch for Team Iceland when you guys were in Netherlands, and I'm wondering how much the preparation in your approach differed when you actually had this team with you rather than a team of your native people from the same country.
Yeah, so what we've been doing is doing retrospective calls after each event, going over what worked, what didn't work, and what can be improved. So it's been an ongoing process for 5 or 6 events now. What can be done better, what worked and didn't work. I think it's a lot about just managing resources, and that being just both time and energy on the day. Also, I guess, into how much detail do you go. I think if you get buried in the details, you kind of just get stuck with busy work and don't see the big picture. So we focused a lot on preparation before the event. So a lot of things were set in stone once we got to the event. I think that was a key point.
And compared to the Netherlands tournament, you said that here you were preparing after every event. So I assume you mean in that sense, like maybe previous ITT, maybe the one tournament you had in Iceland, the one with golden tickets that you and Hyder won. And you mean like those events like Warhammer Fest, all those events coming to this Birmingham team tournament?
So to go over the few that you mentioned, for the Iceland events, I do ridiculous preparation. I estimate what all the strong players are going to be bringing and the people flying over, and get games into specific matchups and way over prepare. So I'm facing the list for the third time perhaps, because I only prepare for 4 or 5 people, and so that's just absolute safety. And I took Desolation Marines with frag launchers instead of Supercrack just because of matchups, and I took Sighting Talons on my Raveners the tournament before that instead of Rending Claws, just because I was facing Custodians and Demons in key matchups, not T-Sons or Emperor's Children. So that's been a key for those single events. I look at all-rounder strong list that can actually go and win the whole tournament when I go to things like Warhammer Fest. So I think, okay, am I going to be the 5th best with this common faction? Do I want to be the best with this faction, do I want to build it differently? So what we felt at WTC last year was we did prep for the pod phase. But after that, we were kind of scrambling, getting estimates from everyone before each round, which took a lot of time. The key difference in Holland was we did estimates for just the 20 or so viable lists competitively at that time. And so we had estimates from everyone before the event. What we did this time around was we had estimates from everyone before the event. We also had estimates into the strongest teams, and we had our first defender and our first 2 attackers into each of the 4 possible factions nailed down before. So in fives, you have realistically four choices: first defender, first attackers, second defender, second attackers. So we had 2 of the 4 decisions already nailed down. We had a few revisions to the England matchup during the event, so we did a little bit of changing right before the match, but overall we had a lot nailed down. So at the event we did very minimal estimates, very minimal prep work right before the match. Half of the decision was already made, so it was just very, very smooth.
Okay, and I think it was heavily influenced by the fact that you do not have a break at those UKTC events. Like you literally go from one game to another, and there's no stopping, and you just have to play another round. So I imagine it was something that you guys had planned like before, that you needed to be over prepared beforehand to not falter when the game comes.
Absolutely, we figured 3 hours each minute during pairings will cut into that. So if we take a lot of time for the first 2 decisions, we'll be rushed and we'll make poor choices.
And you also mentioned that you were going with the approach that I think Brian already knew from when we played at Alpine, basically figuring out 2 counters into everything and then figuring out defender. Was it something, I want to boost my ego, was it something that you guys actually learned from other teams, or was it something that you also figured over time? Because I think that's something that comes quite natural when you figure out pairings. Like as a captain doing pairings, what's your evolution of your approach compared to, say, last WTC and Netherlands and now this event?
So for WTC last year, we were going for the first time, realistically. There had been an Icelandic company that had 8 employees that were, very casual players, and they went and had a very nice time twice and came in dead last twice in 2013 and 14, I think. So we were going for the first time kind of as, okay, we actually play 40K regularly. How do we do this? So because of the rule changes right before the event, there was just a lot of scramble of getting 8 players on 8 viable lists that had some practice into that. So that was very important. I've been doing fives with the German boys, Fred and Arne and Malte and Jan.
On TTS?
On TTS, it's been really, really fun. So my approach, at least to that, is in fives, I think you have to show strength rather than going for tricky plays, because there's just so much, there's not as much room to be tricky, I think. I think if you just show up in strength, you're very likely to do well, versus you may hit and miss with if you go very far and try to be tricky.
I think this is something also that Vic and David mentioned, that you usually need to figure out like the 5 strongest armies, because usually after like 3-4, there's a sudden drop, and the opposing teams should have that common 3-4 armies usually, and there's maybe difference of 1-2. So yeah, I fully agree with it. But you still, I think the whole preparation in that case requires you to figure out the top armies, and I think there's still some room for those alternative approaches. It's way harder to actually pull off. Like, I know you guys, I think David mentioned that you guys were thinking about Chaos Knights. I think this is like a perfect example of a choice that you can making a 5-man, that fifth army would be great, but that army has some polarizing matchups, so it would suck if opposing team comp would basically punish you. And that's something that you can also, in a meta game, force into specific builds. You can also abuse it by building a team that just punishes one specific kind of army, like say knights, which is an army that you can side all of your lists into. But Brian, somebody is calling me. Nope. Okay, that's a change with all the stuff calling me at once. Cool. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. So that was a short interruption, Brian. You've been a part of those few teams, international teams, basically at this point, like in Scotland. Maybe you guys are mostly Scottish. You're not Belgium, after all. And now you've also played in the team Ignite here in Birmingham, and we also played as free dot check in at Alpine Cup.
Mhm.
So, as a player, what is your experience? How all of those teams approached stuff differently, whether it's captains, whether it's a team? I'm like interested. What are your takeaways? Like, we can start with whatever you feel like.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting, right? Because when you have a team that's as large as a WC team, like an 8-man team, I think it's almost impossible to have everybody be at a skill level and a strength as a player where you don't have to consider that factor when assigning armies or making decisions in terms of matchups and stuff like that. Um, and that's certainly true for WTC. I think I challenge anybody who argues that there's a country in the world that can just put up the 8 best players, like 8 players who are just not have no flaws whatsoever in their game. But when you have something like 5s, and I think we saw this in Alpine, and I think we saw this at Birmingham as well. You can have 5 incredibly strong players where you can rely on them. Where if you drop the ball, say getting 20-0'd by Space Wolves in the final round, your teammate is going to pick up the slack and they're going to get the predictions they think, and that those predictions are going to be representative of the reality. Nobody's perfect, but if we're off, we're not off wildly, which sometimes can happen when you have the more inexperienced players, say on a faction or in the game in general. And so I think that's a big change between kind of my experience with 8-mans and my experience with 5-mans. Obviously, Scotland's a bit of a special case because Innes is such an incredible player, and I think I'm on the come up. And then there's a reasonably large delta between that and the rest of the team, who are all still very strong players, but I don't think on the same at least caliber just yet. And so that affects our style far more than say it might affect somebody like Poland or USA, where that skill differential is a little more homogenous, even if it's not entirely so. But when it came to 5-mans, then especially with selecting armies, there were 2 things that I think, at least I personally was really concerned about factoring in, given kind of that's relatively stable skill level, is picking the armies that we're most comfortable with, because I think being really good players, then it becomes a large degree of skill expression in a game, and the better you are with a faction, more comfortable with that faction, the more likely you are to be able to express that in various matchups. And then the second one was, and I think this is a lesson I learned at Alpine, is having teams or having army comps that have a very low floor in terms of, or very high floor, excuse me, in terms of points you can score. And by that I mean just incredible secondaries. Like our Alpine team had, I think all 5 armies had really, really good secondaries. I think the same is true for a Birmingham team. if you want to call Eldar the weakest, but they're so good at the basic secondaries that I don't really consider that a weakness. But every one of our teams had the ability to put up a lot of points, even in scenarios where things are going badly. And what that means is the chances of getting 20-0'd or the chances of just bringing back no points that contribute to the overall win, especially in a format like Birmingham, is big. And I mentioned the format like Birmingham. I don't think you guys have mentioned this, but Birmingham only tied, and if I'm correct here, Yoko, is
If
only
it was
tied if you
50
actually
50.
tied. Yeah. And so what that means is those point or twos you get out of the 218s or the 119s are even more impactful than say in a WTC format where there's a bracket.
Yeah, and also I think when we mentioned the army comp, I think the difference in approach that you mentioned, also players playing whatever they're comfortable with, it is even more visible when you play at Birmingham, where every table is the same, and at
Yeah, for
Alpine,
sure.
where you can actually make choices based on the terrain. And
Absolutely.
did it impact a lot your thought process? Like, let's keep with you, Brian. Like, from your side, you were playing orcs, but like looking from the side, how much the fact that there was no terrain choice, like everybody knew, impacted your team comp and the discussions within your team?
I think it definitely impacted it quite a bit because frequently we were able to focus on other factors of the game that we might not have otherwise been able to put the time into. For example, we knew if we wanted to win this event, we had to go through England, because they're a phenomenal team and they were going to be winning this event if nobody stopped them. And so to that end, we could look at, well, what are the last couple missions, because statistically they're the most likely missions we would play England in. And because the terrain's all the same, we could build our armies to focus on those missions, an army selection to focus on those missions without concern for how does the mission plus terrain impact you, but rather just the mission, which then allows us to. It's just less factors to consider. I mean, usually the terrain is the single most important thing, and it does go into our army selection, but it goes into our army selection that applies to the entire game, entire tournament, as opposed to having to worry about, is this matchup good? Yes, but only on an open board. We know is this matchup good on the terrain, period, and we can focus more on things like how does the terrain change for the given mission, and how does the fact that its mission, the scouring, for example, impact our overall team at once into their overall team. We get to look at the entire kind of package together as opposed to having to evaluate individual armies. And so I think that made a big difference.
I think it also impacts your army choices, to be fair. Like what Jokull, you mentioned, that taking like the top armies that you need to focus on scoring high and being like solid armies and not tricky. I think it's even more emphasized by playing a basically homogeneous terrain pack, where every terrain is the same, because you need to figure out which armies are good and which one of them can play against each other. When you can make unorthodox choices, when you actually have table choices and figure out which armies might have a niche. Even though I agree with you, in 5-mans it's way less applicable than in 8-mans, but I can imagine this changed a lot.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to mention that we play on UKTC a lot, and these boards, while not in a team environment, are things we've played on a lot. And while I've played on WTC boards quite a bit, I'm not even sure that I can say that and I played a lot on WTC boards. I'm not sure that I can say that I've played on every single map for every single mission, all the different combinations, because there are a lot of them. And so there's always things where you don't necessarily have that experience. But for us, when we're writing our lists, these first 6 missions are missions that we are very intimately familiar with. The first 5 being ones you play as long as you just don't go home. Every single time you go to UKTC event, and then the scouring being one, if you make the cutoff rounds, you're always going to play. So it's we're very used to that terrain, and we can build for that with accuracy and comfort in the fact that our decisions are going to be rewarded given our familiarity there.
And Yokul, with what Brian just mentioned, you guys playing basically the same missions and knowing what will be in the playoffs. how much did it impact your army choices or like team composition and whatever you call it, when it came to actually knowing that whatever is the best team, you will probably most likely play it on round 6? Did you account for it in your army building, like knowing maybe you knew beforehand who was in Team England, and like you could tell that Chris Skinner is gonna play Necrons, right? So maybe it impacted you a little bit.
Absolutely, we were quite positive that Chris would play Necrons, that Mike Porter would probably play GSC, that Josh would be more likely to play Space Wolves than Iron Hands. But after that, we weren't absolutely sure. But we figured there would be an Eldar player in there, and then with that, you have 3 strong matchups for Chaos Knights, so you're quite set. I think with this, we have people that are new to WTC this year that are on teams in our team that have maybe played fewer team leagues but more singles, versus England that they have all played a lot of teams before, and I think that having the same terrain favored us because we thought of it half as a single event, because it's basically five individual single games played with combined scoring. So I feel like because you didn't go very tricky, that really worked out on this terrain, I think.
And you just touched on this, that you guys were, I mean, you yourself and Brian, you played in more team events, but the remaining 3 guys didn't as much. They are mostly known as the single players. And did you actually, from your point of view as a team player as well, see a different approach that you needed to tell them sometimes, or like actually enlighten them about certain aspects that they might have missed because they are well-known ITC players?
I mean, we did go into, I did make a Word document called Necron Jank, just about what key Necron units do, because they're not as common in singles. But I mean, we went over GSC and stuff that's less common in singles, but obviously there are, we have very strong players that have played all the factions, but it's just about there's fewer GSC in singles, which I think makes sense. But we were just very lucky, I think, that Brian has such a range. Like I can play Chaos Knights maybe to a 4-1 standard and GSC to a 4-1 standard. My main army at the moment is Iron Hands, but Brian can play Iron Hands and Eldar and Orcs to a world-class standard, and that's just such a big advantage, I think. I think that's at least the key factor that we did go Orcs instead of Chaos Knights for the last slot. It's worth kind of that discussion.
I think it's worth mentioning that while Jokull and I have the more team experience, Vic is on Team England's squad this year. Dave is on New Zealand's squad this year, which will be great to see them there. And Boris, almost made the Team Bulgaria as well. And so we kind of had a lot of WGC players on there. And while they might not have been this year, they've definitely had a mentality for teams and a thought process for teams that has been going on for a while, given that they're going to be going there this year. So I think there was less of a knowledge dump necessary there for the kind of the delta between singles and teams than would have otherwise been necessary. So we're definitely kind of lucky in that sense.
Well, yeah, it makes perfect sense. Also, not to bash on them, they were playing armies with high scoring, like low floor, or sorry, high floor. So those armies also, I think Vic mentioned it, that Eldar are really good in win, draw, lose, but in 20-0 they tend to be worse, which is also why we dropped them for Alpine. I think that was our
I think it was
point
just
back then.
torture why you dropped it for Alpine for me, but that's fair. But I think that is definitely true, and it's something we considered. But that's, while that is sometimes a reliability, in the sense of Eldar sometimes struggle to maybe get those differentials if they don't get the right matchups. In some ways, it's also a benefit, because by the inverse of that, they also keep games relatively close for scoring. And so it's an army which you can tend to throw into difficult situations, and they're going to keep it relatively close. They're always going to get points out of the matchup. And so while we might not necessarily love having somebody of Vic's caliber of play going to a matchup and hoping to get a 10-10 out of it, it's reliably going to be getting that every time. And then if anybody's going to swing up versus an army like Eldar, it's going to be somebody like Vic. He's best Eldar player in the world.
What I was trying to get at when I saw your armies, it made sense that I would say Orcs and Iron Hands are more of a attacker army, those armies that you would consider to score high. And it just happened that you guys had those armies, and I think it might be just a coincidence that you guys were playing it, whilst the players who didn't have as much experience in teams were playing more of a high floor scoring armies, which do not tend to score that high. We saw that the scores didn't relate to that, but it might be just a thing that I saw, and it might not be accurate.
I mean, we knew we were going to have Space Marines. That's kind of a given, and to that, I think Iron Hands, given our team player makeup, made the most sense there. Dave looked at a couple different armies that he had considered, but I think it was probably more of just a happy accident. Like I said, I think our main, if you had to boil down our army selection to a single motivating factor, it would be strength of the player in the faction. It's kind of that faction specialist role, because Dave's obviously incredible with guard. Jokull's got so much experience with Iron Hands and just kills it every time. I'm a half decent orc player. Vic's like really good with Eldar, and then Boris just won the Renaissance Man at Warhammer Fest with his World Eaters. So he's obviously incredibly good with them too. So I think having like 5 players who were very good with their armies was our main motivating there, and it's no small part because this is our first team event, and it's matrixing is such a challenging part of team events, and so having players who know their factions really well and a lot of reps on them, it gives you more accurate predictions. I mean, not always accurate, as evidenced by me saying it's a win against Josh, but more accurate than otherwise predictions against what otherwise somebody might try to say Chaos Knights, where you have less experience with the army. We might get it pretty close, but we're not going to get as close as we otherwise would.
And I think this is also interesting that you guys reached out to like faction specialists about their estimations to like confirm your estimations. If I'm correct,
yeah.
I think that's really interesting. How did you do that in a sense that you might end up with a very conflicting estimations on certain matchups? I remember the podcast where Vic said that you guys thought that World Eaters just bash Necrons, and I don't know who you would have talked as Necron player, but probably most of them would have said otherwise, and then there would be a conversation. Did you have many situations like that?
We had quite a few, I think, right?
Yeah.
Like I know, like for me, and then like pass it over to you for the rest of the team. But for me, Mike's GSC list was one which I felt like was a win for me. And talking to Mike, he also felt like it was a loss for him. But I know we talked to Myson, we talked to Ennis, to the best GSC players in the world, and they both marked it as a draw. And so I looked at that and I said, I'm going to respect both of them and their skill with this army, and I'm going to mark it as a draw myself. And then there's an upside if we swing up, but we're going to assume that if this is played optimally and with somebody like Mike, you can be sure it's going to be played pretty close to optimally, if not exactly so. Then consider it a draw there. And I think that's true for other matchups too, right?
Absolutely, and to touch on the example you took of World Eaters against Necrons, an internal team discussion, we were thinking, okay, you have the plane, which the World Eaters can't interact with. You have the teleporting Locust Destroyer with Real to Wound, which are good into Space Marines. This is UKTC, relatively open. Necrons would do well. This was, just the absolute first take on it. We spoke to someone who had experienced the matchup. What he said was the Necrons die, they score very high, it's draws. And that's kind of where we were at. And I think it didn't come that we actually had to play that during the event. maybe once. Yeah, maybe once.
Boris played early. I remember that being mentioned.
Yeah, and I think I think that may also have just been a skill differential if he did well into that one. But
he drew that one when he played it. He drew that one. So
yeah, yeah.
I'm just curious because that's something that you can see especially when you reach out to different nationalities. Like every country has like their own approach to a meta. Like they have a little swing of the meta where they value certain armies higher or lower. I think last WTC it was clearly visible in the Eldar or Harlequin choice, and that's just apparent when you talk to people from one country. They have like an opinion that's very strong in their community. So, did you have any issues that you would talk to a team or like a player and they would have like a completely conflicting opinion to what you guys might have? Because I can imagine like you would reach out to Antonio for Word Eaters and Antonio would give something that would be just conflicting with Brian when they were talking all the time about Word Eaters versus Orcs, right? And maybe there was something more like that.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some of that happens. You have to calibrate what everyone's opinion is, because you don't know. For example, if I say, I think we had this at Alpine too, for example, with Chaos Knights.
And also other countries might play different turning packs, which impact a lot.
Exactly. So there's different tournament packs, but there's also, has anybody, like the matchup might be good for you, but have you played against a player playing the army in the way that I would or that you would, and that dramatically changes. Like, oh yeah, you smash it every time, but is that actually the reality of the situation, or have you just not played against the types of people or the caliber of player that will actually show you the true representation of the matchup? And so, at least for myself, when it came to it, and we would get feedback on a matchup. For example, when I asked Ennis about GSC, I would just say, what would you rate this matchup as? He would come in with, he said, drawish, and I wouldn't leave it there. I kind of asked him, like, well, can you expand on that? Like, what do you think makes this drawish while other versions of GSC just lose the orcs? What are the components that are different here? And then I can look at that delta and focus entirely on that, and then make a decision of, do I agree that that's as impactful as they believe it is, and kind of game it out from there without having to worry about kind of the entire picture overall, because there's not going to be too much of a difference, I think, there, or you can usually boil it down to a couple of different elements which impact that rather significantly. Did you find anything similar, Jokull?
Absolutely, and key thing that I asked is, have you played this matchup? If it was something that looked odd to me, ask to expand on that. I mentioned that this was UKTC at the beginning of every request for estimates in that. But if there was something that looked really off to us and we just didn't take that full on, or asked for a second recommendation, maybe from the other side of that estimate, or other side of the matchup, I guess. Yeah, but I think just depends on, like, is this a really big team player that has had to give a lot of estimates, or this is a good single player who just is used to just plowing through singles and facing
people not playing for points, which skews your perception.
Yeah,
I think that's one of the things which was beneficial of a tournament like this, where it's not national team based, is we have access to those resources that we otherwise wouldn't. Like, I can't, when Scotland's trying to make its matrix into Poland, be like, hey, Myson, what's it like into you? Can you give us an accurate estimate? Or we can't go to Taraxer for the Thousand Suns, or things like that. Well, in this, we can, and we can leverage those incredible pools of skill and experience in ways that super beneficial.
Yeah, I was quite impressed by this approach. Like, I haven't thought about it myself because I'm used to like the national team versus national team approach, but it makes perfect sense when you're in a mixed team like that. And I assume you asked for the estimations after lists were released, right? Not beforehand. Or did you actually?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah. Like what we did was, we knew there wouldn't be a lot of time, so we had this methodology of having 20-ish viable competitive list that we did estimates for. But a lot of them, or some of them, were maybe 7 or 8 matchups were just a question mark because we hadn't played it. We didn't know exactly how it went, and then we just reached out. Okay, is this something that we are afraid of at all? Maybe we wouldn't go into Shadow Keepers and UKTC and worry a lot about that, we know we're going to be facing GSC versus Claw, and I guess we took a lot more notice after Manny had submitted T-Sons on exactly T-Son estimates post Armor of Contempt. So we did kind of 2 rounds before and after lists with that.
Mm-hmm. So you weren't okay. So you weren't really scared about leaking your lists out there when asking people.
Absolutely not. No. Yeah.
I don't think it impacts it too much. I mean, I think for the most part, our team, it's similar to how we were kind of able to peg 80% of England, right off the get in terms of what armies they're probably going to be playing. I think that they were able to do the same to us, and any other teams that wanted to as well. Vic's probably going to be on Eldar, Dave's probably going to be on Guard, Boris on World Leaders, Jokull and I are the question marks, right? And
but question marks limited to 3 factions total.
Yeah, exactly, right. So you're able to kind of really kind of get those guesses in there and those estimates in, which makes it more tractable of a problem as opposed to every army's possible. What do we do here?
Yeah, and I think it also makes sense when you come to those events where you actually know the field. You can prepare way more. You mentioned, Jokull, that you are preparing for like your single events by looking at the teams, but the players are playing there, and it makes sense for those team events as well. Like we were also doing that kind of for Alpine, right? We are estimating like what the Polish team would bring from the names only, and then trying to slightly adjust our team composition to be better into it. And I think that's just a good approach. And
I think so. You don't want to overcompensate, right? Like I don't think there's any world where any of us would have predicted Manny played Thousand Suns.
Yeah.
So trying to go too deep into it is a bit of a risk, but like hedging your bets, I think is fun.
Yeah. And now you had a comparison between those teams. Like if you were Brian, obviously, if you were to say what was like one takeaway from Scotland, the stat check team, and here Ignite team, like one takeaway from the preparation from each of those, or like the approach, or something that you found being very interesting or something new to you, what would it be?
So with Scotland, the entire process has been new, right? They're my first introduction to teams, and seeing just how preparation in general can dramatically alter the effects. Because coming into this with singles, I had a tendency to just kind of vibe and just whatever happens. Like I'll look at lists and I'll consider some things, but I'm not really doing matchup analysis, stuff like this. I'll just kind of make my list and be like, I think I can handle most of the stuff here. And then with Alpine, it became a much higher level, I think, discussion, because we have like 3 captains for WTC teams on the team, one former captain, and then again one little orc boy just along for the ride, and that became really eye-opening in terms of just the different ways that teams prepare. So, for example, the differences between Poland and Innes's approach or Anthony's approach to things. There's a lot that we all agreed on, but there's a lot that were just fundamental differences. And I think that the preparation really outlined a lot of kind of what you talked about with the meta, and the local meta differences and country differences and strengths of different factions and perceptions of different factions. Like I know you guys going into the event had a weaker view of orcs than you did coming out of it, for example. But obviously Ennis plays against me a lot, so he's very familiar with how powerful orcs can be if they're handled right. And then I think when it comes to Birmingham, because it's all kind of building off each other, seeing how Jokull approached everything was fantastic. It was very organized. It was very methodical. It was very looking at what are our gaps here, and then let's cover those gaps. So the matchups and branching out to other people and trying to make sure that we're not just going to recognize that we have a gap of knowledge here and we hope that it works out fine, but rather we're actively working to try and solve and plug that gap was super helpful. And I think, just the third one or fourth event I come up to for teams is going to be pretty interesting to see how all this comes together, right?
Yeah. And yourself, Jokull? Like, I know you've been at the steering wheel of both Iceland and now here, kinda, not officially from what I heard, but have you taken away anything?
I think the biggest thing from the Iceland going to WTC last year was that it's stronger to have a player who is a faction specialist on a good faction than him playing a great faction they're not maybe as experienced with. I think that was our big takeaway. What we had at that point was we had someone drop very close to the submission, and we had people that had to change armies anyway, so people picked up the strongest armies they could, but that wasn't the ideal way to go. And people that I think would have performed better, me included, would have performed better if we just had taken armies we were more comfortable with, even though they were weaker. I think for this weekend, I think just putting in the time just paid off. I think that was my biggest takeaway there. I think we definitely want to do even better next time, and I think England will come back roaring, and that'll be very interesting for the next event. But it's just adding on a little bit each time. My background is esports, and I when I was doing that, just add on one or two extra things that you didn't do last event to become better, and maybe don't worry about dice rolls or how you did this event or how you got paired this event, but just what did I do well here? What can I do better next time? And then the results will follow, I think.
Okay. I actually also asked people to give questions for you, and Sam Lemon, you might know, he's very into teams as well. He asked a question. Two of his questions I already weaved into the conversation, but one of them is, what is it about Team Ignite that you feel you guys do well as a team group, and where do you feel improvements are to be made? I think that one is very interesting because you're a bigger group now. So where do you see like the gaps now?
Yeah, that is interesting. It's funny you say this because we just, again, this is one of Jokull's strengths. Have a retrospective thread on Discord talking about this kind of stuff. What can we improve on? So, I think there's definitely a couple items that we identified we could improve on. Making sure that we, in this case, where factions were pretty auto selected for us, but I think a lot of times that's not going to be the case. We just got lucky in timing. We have a stable meta and a kind of known.
If it was
10th,
10th,
it was 10th. It would be a bit foobarred there. So having a bigger lead time for the event, I think, is something that we looked at that should definitely be improved on. Logan, do you have any others that you can think of that are worth mentioning?
I think at least in my opinion, I think a big strength of ours is how well the personalities match together, and how I think similar we are in many aspects. My experience with teams so far is there's a lot of different personalities going on, and that's both helpful but can also be distracting. And I think we were just all very focused on doing well at this event and doing our best, and minimal, if any, I can't remember what any real conflict or any disagreements or any
I think we had
anything. So just very, very, very smooth. I think that's a dramatic thing. I mean, we have 7 players now, and these are 5-person events. In Iceland last time, we had basically the 8 players who could go, who were also kind of regulars. But now we have 14 or 15 applications, and people are fighting for spots. And that means that the people that are chosen are taking it more seriously. And I think this will be I think this will be very helpful for us to have a little bit more players than actual slots. So people will, make themselves available on the factions we need and put in the time, and we'll do even better next time, I think. Yeah.
I think it's also worth giving a huge shout out to Chris Radford, one of our team members who, I think he's local to Birmingham, but he came by on the Sunday and actually coached for us, which was, we were one of two teams there with a coach, the other one being Mind Goblins, I think was who was, right? And that was super helpful. You get all the benefits of having a coach with score updates and do you push or do you not? And that was very instrumental in I think our win over England as well at the end. And so having those extra people on the team who are as serious about the team's success and as dedicated as former Chris to take his Sunday off, you could just sit home and just do it literally anything else. Instead, he came in and decided to try and help us win. Really shows that kind of shared mindset that Jokull was talking about.
I think he also just did very well. You can really mess up, doing coaching, and I remember
estimating how it's going, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I've played games where there's a coach for the other team, and the player that I'm playing is going to the bathroom, and the coach is so excited to contribute that he asks me 35 questions, while I'm doing my movement phase, about if this rule allows me to do that, or if I can actually do that, or how far this moves. And Chris is just so professional, and he did a fantastic job, I think.
And now that you've touched on Chris and like the whole coaching thing, how do you value coaches from your experience? Because you have like one WTC experience and here one coach. I find them being something that you just have to have. Like, this is non-negotiable, that you need at least few of them to allow players to perform at their top. But maybe you have like some other takeaways that are not so obvious, like you need them to give you food and basically process information that's going through all the rows. Maybe there's some other use that you just noticed.
I think so for me, this is my first time this year, actually is my first time having a good coach, both on Scotland with our new coach Nick Malone, and obviously with Chris's efforts on Sunday. And the differences between this and other team events I've gone to is night and day. And it's not just their ability to give you score updates and tell you whether you should push or not. But even within that context, knowing when they should ask you questions and when they shouldn't is also a big part of that too. If you're in the middle of something, not stopping you and disrupting your rhythm. But also making sure we're hydrated, making sure that we're doing okay mentally. We're not too fatigued. If we need to take a minute to step away, we can. All of that. I 100% agree with you, Typhus. It's you need it, and I think that it also gives those players an opportunity to be a part of a team win in truly impactful ways where maybe they weren't able to play the game. And I think that in the case of Chris, that's true. When we were playing in home nations with Scotland, Nick I think single-handedly won us 2 rounds with his timing on telling us when to push and making sure that we knew score updates. And there were 2 rounds that we would have otherwise, I don't remember if it would have been losses or would have been like wins the draws or draws the losses or what. But 2 rounds that otherwise would have not resulted in the points we got had it not been for his presence and for his diligence there.
At least I can speak for Iceland. We struggled last year big time, like really struggled. It's not the hottest nation, and it was, let's say, warm in the hall,
and you chose full-on tracksuits.
We did, yeah. Oh my god! But I almost physically fainted during my last singles game. Like physically, I had to stop and sit down and pour water on myself. During the last game, I almost fainted physically. And you have the reverse of, there was a team that had a cooler with cold towels and things on hand, and also just estimates during the game, and like our plan was, oh, people are doing this, okay, Michael Hooper, you always crush people with Chaos Knights immediately, can you help us halfway through the round? And he did a fantastic job, but we were always an hour and a half behind on things, and then it was just a scramble between the games of trying to get food, trying to get this, trying to get pairings, and I was doing pairings and playing the singles and the teams, and it was just too much, and so now we have 3 people not playing that are coming with us, and it's going to be absolutely fantastic. Yeah,
that's a huge improvement. A lot of stuff that you do not need to think as a player, and there's a reason why professional teams in sports have coaches and like the whole managing stuff, like staff by spelled with A, not U. So that helps you out. And now that I spoke about it, like with the whole preparation, you being very methodical and like having a structure, how much would you say that your past in playing in Fanatic, StarCraft, Hearthstone translated to actually applying it here? Because I would expect that in a game that's also about managing risks, it would actually quite translate.
So yeah, I was the coach for Tempo Storm in the Hearthstone League back in the day, and there you have 3 decks, and you're facing 3 decks, and you have to do estimates, and it's just so important to do pre-prep, and so that's very helpful full on, and with that you have VODs of players playing, which is different from Warhammer, because you don't have VODs of players playing, but we did so much analysis, watched so much footage, and I think putting in the time really helps, and I think that's just so valuable in the team aspect, but also I think improving in singles, and that's something we're looking at for Team Ignite, for the next 12 months, is improving in singles in other ways than just playing our factions well and talking about lists and strategy.
So you're not only like a bunch of friends, but you're also looking into more professional side of it, and like the approach being more structured overall as a team.
I think for sure, right? We had a long conversation the Friday, I think it was Friday night before the event, on a similar subject to this, kind of like trying to decide, whether or not talent exists in the form of 40K, or is it really just hard work disguised, or what does this mean, and what does a maturing 40K scene look like in terms of our development as players, and how much more we can grow in terms of our abilities. And the general consensus we all reached, which I think is the reality, is there is a tremendous amount of room still to get better, and do better, and I think that we all are kind of going to be focusing on that for next year, trying to make some of that a reality.
I think seeing the scene and like competitive international scene since, what was it, 2012 in my case, I see it maturing a lot. And I see it turning more and more professional. I do not mean only people who are actually making a living of it, but actually changing the approach to less, let's go out, get drunk, and enjoy pushing plastic soldiers. But actually, the prep, like hearing the changes in preparation for WTC and seeing it on my own, how much more is needed. I think we are getting there. And we are, I would still say, at the very beginning of this game becoming actually something competitive.
I think that's definitely true. And I think that Jokull is able to provide a really interesting context on that, coming from esports, because he's seeing what a game that is far further advanced along this track than we are, and which is why, at least certainly, I respect so much of any of his ideas that he's bringing forward. Is I look at it that he's bringing this from the context of somebody who played, competitive chess, played competitive Hearthstone, like played these much more professional games, and these are habits and practices which were successful there, and it's not just coming from like a Nordic sense of being methodical, but rather like a place of of like, I know this works if you trust the process, and there's a lot more. It's a lot easier to trust that process when you know that he's coming from that side.
Yeah.
I think I could say at least, that what I've been looking at is I was looking for LVO, I was playing Tyranids. I knew that Brian was, I think, at least top 3 in the world when it comes to the combat phase, how he moves. And I studied exactly how he moves, and it's just an eye opener. You saw so many tricks and so much detail that you can pick up. I think that's maybe the next step here is this looking at individual microprocesses for players, how they can do things better. And I think a key point during the last weekend that we maybe was Vic's game into Matt Robertson. He played the Eldar Mirror, and I've played against Liam VSL from Belgium, who is a fantastic Eldar player, who's very very good aggressive Eldar player, and he got, I think, 97 out of 100 at the Euro Cup or something ridiculous, with Eldar. And then you have Vic VJ, who's probably, arguably one of the best singles Eldar player in the world. I think he's second ITC, so the singles you don't have to win big. So I really wanted to have Vic learn the Liam VSL style, and he played Liam and he spoke to Liam and he went into it, and then he absolutely demolished Matt Robertson when needed. Like, okay, I have to push, okay, like, and he took grind and assassinate in the Eldar Mirror, which is just, and winning 17-3 when you're going second in the Eldar Mirror is no easy feat, especially into Team England. So I think like him picking that up and doing that and performing was just very important.
I think there's like a very well-known graph with a bell curve when you know nothing. So you kind of are in the middle, and then you know a lot, so you're kind of at the same point of knowing it. Like when you start doing something, you say like I know everything, I can do everything. Then you learn a bit, then you realize that there's so much more to learn, and at one point you realize that you know enough to be confident in yourself again. And I think this case,
I think is the name.
I do not know the wise words.
Or you know just enough to realize you know nothing, and then you start that process over again.
Yeah, but I think this is a case like if you were playing at the bottom table against some random Eldar player and they took assassinate and grind, you'll be like, okay, he doesn't know what he's doing. And then you see Vic doing it at the like top level in the top game, and you're like, I surely missed something. I'm about to get wrecked, and I don't know yet why. And I find it always eye-opening when you actually watch other players. That's what we've been doing as Team Poland last year, like watching each other play and realizing how much the approach to a given matchup can differ from a player to player. And I think this is something that you guys playing on TTS and probably watching each other games, it just fast forwards your personal development and skill development so fast that, like you mentioned, Jokull, watching Brian do the combat phase, right? You just watch a few TTS games and you just soak it in.
I think with our team especially, like what I felt very excited about was that we have people here that are extremely good at 40k, but do not give 20s for every estimate, even though they have won every game possible in that matchup, and that go into games that they have something to learn, not something just to blow people out, So we have some of the best players in the world who, are continuously learning, and that's not, across the board. And having every person on the team like that is just a very exciting prospect, for the next few years.
Yeah, you cannot rest on your laurels. Like I think that's a saying.
And
Brian,
England's gonna be coming back hungry. And
I think it also applies to WTC, right? You had like previous top dogs who didn't prepare as much, and I think this year will be. Everyone will not have July in their life. That's my expectation.
I think that's definitely true. I mean, like last year, I think with WTC is a prime example of this, where while Australia was incredibly skilled with Liam Eric and all of them, I don't think that they were the most skilled team in the room, but they were the most prepared. They put in the most work, and the result is they won it. They won it all. So, and I think that and between that and then obviously the effort that went into Birmingham now, it's really made me a much stronger believer in the value of preparation. Where it's not just about who has the better players, but it's about who puts in the most work.
And especially with 10th coming in, where everyone will need to figure out from the start. We're starting with a blank slate, and maybe obviously internet and information sharing will probably cause us to have like few archetypes of armies being in the game, but I still expect like those top teams to figure out 2-3 wild, completely out there armies that nobody would figure out, and those would be kept secret. And I just cannot wait to see.
I'm super excited for the teams
list
that
submission.
that bring armies that they think are going to be incredible and end up being awful, and that people look at and say this is awful and end up being incredible. I mean, both are going to happen, and it's going to be awesome.
It's gonna happen to everyone, I can imagine, and it will be great. It will be great to actually narrate all of this from sidelines and see people go mad.
Yeah, like I'm very excited about our captain in Iceland. He listens to almost every podcast because he has the luxury of doing work to be able to do that. And like as soon as
who's your captain?
Heiðar.
Okay.
Heiðar, and so what's excited that as soon as new rules come out, he has been listening to this non-stop, and he has been listening to our army list ideas, and he shows up with the most unique things and smashes people. So new rule set is definitely his forte. So I'm very excited to see what he brings.
Yeah, and now that we touched upon the looming 10th, what are your guys' plans coming in the next few weeks? Like there were leaks that the 10th will be out in basically 2 weeks, that we will have indexes. So you're just laying low and chilling, and then when indexes go out, you just bang it in non-stop 2 months of only 40k, or what are your plans exactly? I know some of yours, Brian, but
so I've got a couple team events in Poland coming up in July, which will be a lot of fun. But beyond that, it's a lot of just practice. I mean, I fully expect to try and ask for as many games as I can against various players to try and learn the game as quickly as I can. But I also fully expect to sit there playing chess against myself in the form of whip up 2 armies on TTS, play it out, get an idea of matchups, get an idea, is this army actually viable, and kind of going about it from that. In addition to all the practice days and all the other formal things we have planned, and then just communicate with my team, and everyone else we're working with, and trying to make sure that it's all gonna work, and we're divvying up the workload. It's going to be interesting. I don't know. It's my first major edition change from a competitive standpoint, so
yeah.
I'm just trying to embrace the chaos, ride the wave.
From my experience, it's always wild.
Yeah.
Let's just hope the rule set will not be bad. And yourself, Jokull, do you have anything coming in, or?
So I've been away a lot for events because I always fly over to the UK, and so I'm hoping to spend a lot of time with my wife for 2 or 3 weeks now, and play as little 40k as possible, and hopefully the indexes don't leak, so I'll be stuck on the phone. But I'm definitely hoping to making all this travel up to her. But I think I was asked yesterday about my thoughts about, not sure exactly what faction it was, but and then they have Battle Shock, and my response was, what is Battle Shock? Because I've been looking at the Birmingham Team Tournament and preparing for that. But it would be very exciting, and I'm hoping I've had a plan generation in the making. I started to paint a GSC army when they were at their peak, late 8th, and they just got nerfed again and again and again. And when I finished the army, they were one of the worst factions in the game. They've come back a little bit, but comparatively different. But I've got 200 plus painted GSE figures I really want to use, I'm hoping GSC will be viable, and thankfully.
So not only you, Brian, have hobby goggles.
Yes,
From
exactly.
what I hear.
Although, based on that preview for GSC, I don't think they're particularly thick hobby goggles. If Jokull
Yeah,
has them.
fair. Yeah, fair. And do you guys see actual prep like hinder the team ignite? Because now every team will start being a little bit secretive, so you might not want to share as much information between each other. Have you guys talked about it?
I don't think so. I don't think that there's so much. Like, I don't think there was information gained by people sharing things with other people. For example, like one of my favorite things to do after an event, I think Jokull does the same with this, is let's exchange matrices. Let's like get an idea of
Yeah.
who was wrong, basically, and where were we wrong, and then we can discuss ones that are wildly different. And I think that's largely true. I think that you're not really losing information, or you're not really giving away information, especially in an environment where we're switching to a totally new environment, to a totally new edition. But let's pretend we weren't. You're not really giving away. You're learning old information, right? The old meta, the old teams between balanced updates and chapter approves and everything else coming out, and then just general shifts in the meta. The idea that the same information you had is going to be relevant at the next team event when there's 3 or 4 a year next year that we're looking at trying to do. It's pretty silly. I think you gain way more by improving your process with sharing the information than you do by trying to keep it secret and keep it safe.
I agree with that. There's another reason why me and Maison wanted to invite you and Ines to have that week in Poland. Anyway, like on a closing note, I would like to give you a curveball. If ETC/WTC starts next week, what are your 8 armies, Jokull?
In 9th edition, yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Guard, Eldar, WTC Iron Hands. It'll be Slanesh Demons. It'll be the 4th. I'll do mixed hybrid called GSE as the 5th. Do Chaos Knights as the 6th. Then it gets tricky. I would play Orcs as the 7th. And after that, I think probably Sisters. Yeah.
Ooh, because Mitch?
It's
No,
the Mitch
no.
factor.
They're actually, I think, very good. Yeah.
Okay.
It's the Mitch factor.
And yeah, I think so. Like you're basically being gaslighted by him at this point.
Yeah, that's fine. I think mine would be Iron Hands, GSC, kind of the industrial list we usually see, or some version with trucks. I'm not sure which one would be better.
I think both of them are fine.
Yeah. As much as it pains me because I can't get away from this army in teams, Orcs, Eldar, which would be Swift Strikes for sure. I really like Chaos Knights. I really like Necrons. Let's see.
You have
so
6. Two more left.
Two more armies. I would say I think World Eaters is good. I think they're worth having. And then probably some kind of demons. I don't know if it's Disciples or if it's Zinch, but I think either way it would be a focus on Zinch stuff. Just maybe a Belk or maybe you don't.
The fact that you wanted Word Eaters and Jokull didn't makes me wonder whether Jokull just values Word Eaters low or he was gaslit so much that he thinks Sisters are better.
It's definitely the former.
I mean, I just want 2 defenders. That's But I think Guard is a good defender, but I just don't value custodians, and some people value custodians. Yeah. I'm not a fan.
I don't value it as well.
But that's where it's at. I think World Eaters is okay, but it needs to be babysat a bit. And to emphasize, though, would be Sisters with Imperial Knights. But that'd be it.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter. But I think we are at the point of a meta being so polished and like figured out that there is not much. If I asked you this, 2 months ago, 3 months ago, 2 months ago, I think, it would have been completely wild.
Yeah.
So cool. Do you guys want to do any shout outs or anything on your end?
I guess the only two I would mention is obviously, Innes and Anthony's main program. Those are the main one with StatCheck, and then just remember that we're on StatCheck halfway through that plug, by the way. And then the second one would be Vic and Dave's podcast that you mentioned, Fireside. They do a great review of maybe from a more matchup perspective.
And I will link in the description if you somehow ended up here and not there. I will link that podcast so you can. And I would say, I think they deserve it.
Personality, Typhus. That's why people end up here. It's good pull to you.
I think.
Why?
I think I just want to mention Chris again that for coming on Sunday. I think he is definitely someone to look out for. I think out of my teammates, he has the best win rate against me, Chris Radford, and scary player to face. And I think he'll be doing very well in this year to come. And Boris just was so impressive and dominant during this event, and the things that he has done just in 40K is just mind blowing. Overall, so I'm very impressed. I want to give them two shout out.
Yeah, and in the more distant future, there will be a weird merge of StatCheck and Ignite coming over to tournaments. I expect so, as you Brian know already.
Yeah.
So
pretty good.
Yeah. Thank you very much for joining in. Thanks God that Brian actually mentioned the other parts of the podcast because I'm so bad at doing the shout outs, etc.
I didn't do it. I had to do it. Listen to twice speed if you want to have an Innis impersonation.
No, mate, there's no way I'll do it. But thank you very much for listening to this episode of Enter the Matrix. I had Brian and Jokull joining me. If you want to listen to other podcasts from our network, you have X and One, which talks about completely different spectrum of what we talked about. We are more on the very serious, we do it for a living side, and they are more like, I want to live and still be able to play side. And yeah. Why?
Yeah, I don't get it.
And we have also the regular show. Last time we had like a big retrospection of all the stats of this whole edition, where you can see that there was actually a point of one army being over 80% win rate, which is also a great sign of GW knowing how to balance things. So thank you very much for joining. I hope I will catch you as soon as the new edition drop. I think we'll grab you for your knowledge about certain armies, and especially in the WTC prep, I will gladly grab you and debrief you, especially after lists, to grab some hot takes, and so you can shit on people and not be so polite as you were this time.
What were they thinking?
Thank you, everyone, and see you.
Bye.